All through this time, of course, by this time what was called the Soviet Union, the name USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was first used in 1923. Here they were facing the fact that one of the most prominent supporters and people who tried to get their ideology across before the revolution was now in emigration in Italy. Their great champion was not in the Soviet Union, but rather in Italy, and of course from the West it looked rather strange and perhaps even encouraging that this writer with a world reputation was not in the Soviet Union, but rather in emigration in the West. Delegations came to Gorky to try to get him to come back. By 1927, Lenin, of course, had died in 1924. By 1927, Stalin was consolidating his power, and his agents persuaded Gorky to return to a very changed homeland, partly because some of the people who had taken over cultural life and whom Gorky did not want to be in power were being purged by Stalin. So Gorky decided that he would come back and see what it was like. Stalin promised him that he could leave at any time. And so in 1927, he came back to a tremendous reception organized in honor of one of his literary anniversaries. He traveled through the Soviet Union and undoubtedly was pleased at the obvious happiness of the Soviet public opinion that their own writer had at last come back home. And of course, the Soviet Union considered this an important propaganda victory in the area not only of Soviet public opinion, but world public opinion. Gorky was by this time very deeply involved in the intense political and social struggles connected with Soviet control and direction of culture, made even more complicated by a host of political and personal intrigues among the writers. A whole series of new organizations came to life, each one promising to create and promote an entirely new kind of literature, reflecting the new style and psychology of an entity called rather pompously the New Soviet Man. It was to be entirely proletarian in form and content, completely rejecting the old so-called bourgeois norms from an earlier life. The popular phrase was a Marxist term, tabula rasa, that is, a wax tablet scraped completely free of its previous form and shape. It's not hard to understand these new phrases included a great deal of nonsense, but many artists at the time thought the struggles might open the road to a new and perhaps more exciting kind of art, music, and literature, to a no small degree, the opening of a language to a whole new class of people, a whole new categories of words and forms and so on. They hoped to see a whole new Soviet form of the famous late 19th and early 20th century avant-garde. These people who wanted this entirely new literature had done some very interesting things with literature, but of course they made very unreliable allies from the point of view of the Bolshevik government. The Bolshevik government was quite radical politically, but artistically rather conservative in taste. And of course, when they saw these new radical writers who were doing all kinds of new things, some of which were almost impossible to understand, they realized that these were not the kind of allies that they wanted. They rather turned to Gorky, a man who, after all, had been traditionally a supporter of their government. Now, Gorky had acquired his education through his own very intense, totally personal efforts. He found it very painful that the very revolutionaries whom he had admired and supported were ready to throw out the classic of world civilization. He wasn't ready to see Cervantes, Shakespeare, and Tolstoy so quickly and light-mindedly abandoned. His idea of revolution meant making such figures who previously belonged to a small elite segment of the population the property of the common people, as we talked about before, the idea of world literature available to every worker, every peasant, everyone in the entire Soviet population. He wanted to raise their cultural level to the same level as the former Russian aristocracy. He rejected the idea of destroying the best parts of past culture in the name of class warfare. This, of course, put him at odds with some of those very people who were the avant-garde, some of those very people who were trying to work out a new proletarian culture. Well, they decided that the time had come to establish an entirely new writers' organization. Now, you understand, many of these writers saw Gorky as an old-fashioned figure with Philistine tastes. As a matter of fact, he was even, in some cases, accused of counter-revolutionary ideology, and these charges were not to be taken lightly in the politically charged atmosphere of that period. As long as Gorky had been in Italy, the radical writers could sneer at him, tucked away in his comfortable villa near the gentle Mediterranean climate, far from the cold of Russian winter and the blast furnace heat of literary polemics amidst Bolshevik politics. But when Gorky came back and became the subject of government-sponsored adulation, it became much harder in the USSR to attack him or his ideas, and it soon became clear that Stalin had other ideas for the development of Soviet literature and Gorky's place in it. The result was the establishment of the Soviet Writers' Union, a new organization which would give considerable material support to these writers as long as they would write what the government wanted them to write. Of course, these previous guys who had brawled among themselves, who'd written all kinds of what seemed to the Soviet people utter nonsense, they even called their work trance-sense, that is, going beyond sense into nonsense. This was hardly artistic work calculated to appeal to the working class, the common man, the so-called new Soviet man. So the new apparatus came up with a new plan. No longer would the artists and writers be allowed to group and regroup themselves in unseemly bands of squabbling and cacophonous ideologists. Instead, they'd all be gathered together within an organization formed and tended by the state. The administrators of this behemoth would see to it that the writers were inspired by love for the collective ideas of socialism and united by their loyalty, or at least expression of loyalty, to the all-seeing and all-caring Soviet state. And of course, from Stalin's point of view, the logical person to be the protagonist of the new organization was Gorky, a writer whose prestige came from pre-revolutionary times and lent itself to the twists and turns of the Soviet epoch. Gorky, after his return to the USSR, hoped that he could do under Stalin what he had previously done under Lenin, that he could intercede for writers, that he could push the culture in ways that would be very good for the culture. But it wasn't very long before he became disillusioned. He certainly couldn't save people's lives under Stalin. Stalin was not about to listen to some writer in saving people's lives. He was able to defend some writers from suffering after virulent attacks from the radicals, but he wasn't able to do, in general, what he wanted to do. But he thought that if he could put Soviet literature on what he thought was the right track in this new organization of the Writers' Union, it would command considerable state funds, which would be awarded generously to those writers who'd follow the state line. And of course, that new line was soon designated as socialist realism. What Gorky had in mind was the use of the best kind of realist prose produced in 19th century France and Russia. He was thinking, of course, of Zola, of Balzac, of Tolstoy. But instead of attacking the weaknesses of bourgeois society, it would praise the energies which were being devoted to the creation of a socialist society. But, in the old days, you had conflict in literature between good and evil. How could you have conflict between good and evil when there was no evil in the society, by definition? Well, they decided, instead of being a struggle between good and evil, it would be a struggle between the better and the best. It was hardly a formula for producing exciting reading. It was often satirized by a deliberate misuse of the old Hollywood slogan, boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy marries girl. The new slogan would be, boy meets tractor, boy falls in love with tractor, boy marries tractor. In spite of Gorky's high-minded intentions, he stated emotionally, I've seen this in a documentary film of that meeting of the writers, that first meeting of the Writers' Union, he emotionally stated he was not seeking to control what writers would say. He said, look, we are taking away from you only one privilege. That is the privilege of writing badly. When he said this, he burst into tears. It was obvious that he was under a very great emotional pressure at that particular time. Babil, a very famous Soviet writer, later on said, well, he said, there's been taken away from us only one privilege, according to Gorky, the privilege of writing badly. And now, he said, I am practicing a new genre of literature, a new form of literature. It's the genre of silence. And of course, when Babil said that, people began to understand what was going to happen to literature. When writers have to produce literature which says what other people want them to say, what you get is, of course, not good literature. What you get is somniferous stuff that puts people to sleep almost immediately. And of course, what they produced under so-called socialist realism was a huge pile of virtually unreadable literature. At that time, Gorky himself did try to write at least one very famous work in Soviet literature. It was called Belomor, that is the construction of the White Sea Canal. By this time, Stalin's regime was arresting hundreds of thousands and even millions of people and putting them into so-called forced labor camps where they were forced to do terribly hard labor under very, very difficult, if not to say inhuman conditions. And one of the great projects that he did was the construction of a canal that eventually would unite all of Russian seaports going from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea. And of course, this would be the so-called White Sea Canal that would connect the White Sea with the Baltic Sea and with a series of lakes and canals that would get to the Volga River. People were living in absolutely inhuman conditions. They were forced to work in the dead of winter in the forest without proper clothing, without proper tools. They were forced to do almost inhuman kind of labor, which made people sick in a very short amount of time, and of course caused a tremendous number of deaths, eventually caused millions and millions of deaths in the 1930s in Russia. And Gorky went to examine this. Now, presumably, what they were doing, that is, what the propaganda said, was that these camps were to re-educate people so that they would, from having been bourgeois who had exploited other people, they would be turned into good socialists and know the value and the joy of creative labor. Gorky went there. And naturally, when the places that he went, what they constructed was a scene that was in no way like what was actually happening in the camps, trying to pull the wool over his eyes. Now, there are many people who claim today that Gorky, as a matter of fact, understood exactly what was happening, but in spite of the fact that he did understand, he wrote exactly what the Bolsheviks wanted him to write. And the result is that that particular work made him very, very unpopular with people who loved literature in the Soviet Union, not to mention people who cared about humane values, because here he was taking a project which was killing millions of people and praising it as some kind of re-education of people. This did not do anything good for Gorky's reputation. As Stalin consolidated his power even more tightly in the 30s, Gorky's own position became more and more untenable. Publicly, he was praised in official terms, exaggerated to the point genuinely of nausea. He was seen in the most unflattering way by those who understood anything about real literature, especially by his old friends. Thousands of collective farms were named after Gorky. The major street in Moscow was named after Gorky. The city in which he was born, formerly Nizhny Novgorod, the name was changed to Gorky. Some of you no doubt have read a novel called Gorky Park. One of the major parks in Moscow was named after Gorky. Everywhere you turn, there were things in the name of Gorky. Of course, from the point of view of somebody who cared about genuine humanity, this was a revolting sort of thing. And Gorky himself was increasingly isolated in luxurious surrounding controlled by the organs of state security. In 1936, he died under conditions which seemed ambiguous at best. The Soviet Union claimed that he'd been killed by fascist agents. Many people, naturally, when this was said, thought that he was actually killed by Stalin's agents. On the basis of some evidence that I was able to get in the Soviet Union, I think there is good evidence that he died a natural death, although it was at least brought on partly by a depression resulting from the circumstances of his life under Stalinist control. And of course, it was shortly after his death, the Soviet government began the dreadful time of Stalinist purges, which swept up more millions of innocent people into forced labor camps and sentences to death by firing squad. So that the name of Gorky, in the mind and the imagination of people who care about literature, and for that matter care about humanity, is often seen in a very negative light. But of course, this negative light overlooks many of the things that he actually did in order to try to lighten the lot of Russian people, not only before the revolution, but also under the Soviets. The fact that it was he who preserved in the 1920s the possibility of Russian culture. The fact that it was he who somehow or other tried to protect writers even in Stalinist times is something these people tend to overlook. So that today in Russia, the name of Gorky is a name subject to tremendous argument between those who see some of the good things that Gorky did and those who can only see the official line that was taken with things named after him, with official flattery, with Stalin's praise, and so on and so on. We're left with a very, very interesting figure, a man who at times was capable of writing very powerful literature.